Hi, folks. Welcome to Walking on the Weene Side, part of It Matters Radio. And today I have an old friend of It Matters Radio on. Steve Lindahl is from the South. He lives in Greensboro, North Carolina, where he writes some very intricate novels. I think often taking us deep into history. And the novel we're talking about today is called Under a Warped Cross, and it has to do with very long ago in England, but it also happens to have to do with a topic we were just talking about last week, incest. And so kind of synchronicity there that we are able to bring the two topics together. And also another topic that's implied by the title, The Cross. This is a book about religion and religion's good and bad impacts on society. And of course, the other thing that just recently happened is that the people of Ireland voted overwhelmingly to allow abortion and to change the Constitution so that abortions can be allowed. Now, not like, oh, everybody should have an abortion, but rather that there should be better, more open availability for those women who need it. So these are topics that all integrate now here in this book. It's called Under a Warped Cross, and it is by my guest today, Steve Lindahl. Steve, welcome.
Well, hi, I'm glad to be here.
So which shall we talk about first? Theocracy, church history, British history, abortion?
I like to think of the book as primarily about church abuse in the 10th century. So that would be the first place I'd go. The book starts out with a false accusation of incest and moves on from there. So a lot of the ramifications that occur later on in the book occur because of the false accusation and the punishment that came to someone who was wrongly accused. So
let's talk about that punishment for a moment, Steve. The punishment, and I know you research your books well. I've read a couple of your books before.
I do.
I know they're well researched. So you went and found out what the punishment the church would have meted out back in those ancient days to somebody who was accused of incest. And in that case, the punishment was what?
Yeah, in this particular case, the punishment was cutting off the woman's nose.
The woman's nose?
Yes. The
and the means? And the means?
And the hands?
Man.
The man? Nothing happened to the man.
Of course not.
That was typical, too.
Yes, of course. That's part of what I wanted to get at.
Yeah.
Sexism of what happens in theocracies in general. Theocracies are very sexist in general. And so the poor woman's nose is cut off, disfiguring her for life, presumably in addition to disfiguring her, making her health rather questionable.
Right.
Yeah. And so she is left with very, very few options. And her option is that she does take is, of course, she runs off with a sibling.
Right. What I developed in the story is kind of like an underground railroad in medieval times. There were victims of the church, and there were good people. There's always good people in all time periods. And some of the people in my novel saw the problems of church victims and helped them establish new lives and paid for places for them to live. So that's the undercurrent of some of the good things that happen in the book. It's a mixture of some of the horrors in a very brutal time period, and also some of the people who step up and help others out.
Yeah, this is a very Hobbesian time. I think this is the time. This is the time when Hobbes wrote his Leviathan, and he talks about the brutal nature of life, and how we need laws in order to control that. This is the kind of that brutal kind of life that he's talking about. Except in reality, often the brutality is coming not from people living next door to each other, but from the very authority.
Right. And the authority could be the crown, but it also could be the church, because there were two power structures in Britannia at that time.
Mm-hmm. You also suggest then that there is this ongoing conflict that eventually, of course, under Henry VIII gets resolved. But for centuries in Britain, there was this ongoing conflict between church and crown.
Right. And I think that's true. They worked hand in hand at times, but there was definitely a conflict as to who had what powers.
And one of the interesting things is, of course, in some societies where that kind of church power is identifiable, usually it's because there was a monolithic church. As, for instance, in England at that time, of course, it was the Roman Church. There was no other church. All the other kinds of reproaches had been wiped out and were continually wiped out throughout history by things like the Inquisition, until the Reformation anyway. But up till then, it was there'd be a church, or in other parts of the world, say in Russia, it was not the Catholic Church, but the Orthodox Church. In Iran, it was the Muslim faith, specifically the Shia faith. And so you have this balance in what is kind of like often a three-part kind of thing, a troika. And of course, we all know triangles give balance, in which you have the church, the state, the government, and then you have some third part. And for example, in England, of course, it was the aristocracy that eventually forced the Magna Carta. So you try and get this in Russia. It was there was a parliament, the Duma, and you try and have this three-pronged approach, and it keeps balance. So historically, at this point, of course, there is this absence of a balance because you only have the two.
Right. At this point in time, this was the 10th century, and the church had a very large foothold, but there was also a pagan religion that was strong, and parts of the book go up to Scandinavia where it was even stronger still.
Yeah, I was going to mention going up to Scandinavia.
Yeah.
The reason I was talking about all that was because I'm a very strong opponent of theocracies.
Are you?
Okay, so
they have definitely had a lot of problems when the church itself is running the government. I can see your point.
Yeah. Well, okay, so this, of course, one of the things you bring up in the book, and I think it's very interesting, and of course there was a fairly popular television series a while back, it may still be on, I don't know, called Vikings, that raises the same thing, that there's really quite a lot of interchange going on between Britannia, and the Vikings of the Norse from up in Scandinavia.
Exactly. And some of that interchange was raids, and in particular on places like the Nendrum Monastery in Ireland, which is a part of the setting in my book too. Those were areas that had quite a bit of centralized wealth, but not a lot of security. They depended on, for security, they depended on the faith of the people attacking them. And sometimes, if that wasn't there, the people came in with a lot of force and stole people to be sold or used as slaves, as well as some of the monetary jewels and gold that were accrued in the monasteries.
Yeah, and when I was in Ireland, I was struck that some of the monasteries, they'd have like a tower, and they would have one door, and they could seal that door up, or maybe the door was way up high, and they could drop a ladder. But basically, the idea was, okay, we're way up here, and you can't get at us. Ha ha ha.
Well, in the monastery that I covered in the book, Nendrum, they did have a tower. It was right next to the church that was in the center of the monastery area. But they also had 3 gated walls that were stone walls, which were set up. And basically, the higher you were in the structure of the church, the closer to the center of the monastery you got to be. And so the more protection you had. But there were also farms or large gardens within that area, dormitories for some of the lower people who did not have their individual homes. But the leader of the monastery, which would be an abbot, he would have a home up in the very center. So it had a structure in the monasteries at that time. And I think that followed through on some of the other monasteries too.
I would imagine so. And so while you folks have a chance to take a look at this next message, and we'll be right back with Steve Lindahl.
The Ripeness of Fruit by Kenneth Weene. Badria wakes. The sun is not yet up. The cock has not yet called. Perhaps it was the hoot of loons, the stirring of goats in the barn, the restless wandering of the wind among the budding cherry trees. Does the wind taste the tart ripeness of the fruit, she wonders? She bends to the fire. Charcoal is dear and they have little. Badria tries to ignore the cold of her hands, the chill that sneaks beneath her heaviest robe. The fire must be used to heat water for Farzam's tea, to heat the rice for his breakfast. For Badria's part, cold water will do. Whatever warmth lays hidden in yesterday's rice pot will suffice. But Farzam's tea. Where does the winter go, she asks herself, when the earth comes back to life, when the nights again are warm and the days glow with heat and desire? Perhaps the teacher who has come to the village knows the answer to such questions. She would ask him if allowed, but Badria is not allowed. Women do not speak to men, not even to teachers, particularly not to teachers. It is written, that is enough. The spark catches, the handful of straw flares, a corner of the rich charcoal smolders. While the red heat spreads, she fetches water from the well. The water is clear and cold. She uses some to wash her face. The hem of her garment serves as washcloth. As Badria walks, the wet corner clings to her leg. She giggles. Sensation is enough to bring laughter or tears. Badria's body sings. It is the song of life. How could it be otherwise? Even at 11 years, she is woman. Even at 11 years, the child within her blooms. It is written, that is enough. Farzam will soon wake. Where is my tea? He will bellow. She will have it ready. He will be pleased. He will not hit her. He will not curse her father for a bad deal. He will not demand the 3 goats back. She will be worth the price.
Welcome back to Walking on the Weene Side. Well, we're talking today about a very brutal world, the world of Britain, Scandinavia, Ireland in the Middle Ages, and we're talking about the Vikings would come raiding. Now the Britons were more farming people. They were not as much seagoing as they are now. Nowadays, of course, we think of them as very much a maritime nation, but at that point they mostly were more sedentary. They farmed. I suppose they might have farmed more up in Scandinavia if the weather been a little better. I don't know.
They actually in Scandinavia at that time they were a majority farming nation too. In fact, it's interesting to know what killed most Vikings. Most Vikings were killed by loss of their teeth, and that occurred because their process of kernstones used to grind wheat into flour actually left grit inside the flour and inside their bread and destroyed their teeth and ended up killing a lot of Vikings. Because people think always of Vikings as exclusively being out on the sea and exclusively being involved in the raids. But a lot of times these were farmers who went out on raids part-time in order to accrue a little extra wealth to go along with their sheep farming or wheat farming or whatever they were involved in.
They weren't just out looking for good dentists then.
No, no, they could have used them.
Sure could have. Okay. But they developed ability to navigate. They knew more about navigation, and that's
right.
Of what one. So why don't you talk a little bit about those Viking boats and navigation, because it does play a big part in your story.
Sure. Yeah. The Vikings, the boats were very interesting because they had shallow keels. So they were fairly large boats, and they could carry a number of people. But because they had shallow keels, anywhere you had a sloped beach-type entry, they could run right up there. And they could even run into rivers and inland waterways. So whereas the boats that were developed in Britain were taller and had deeper keels and couldn't manipulate as quickly and as fast. So the structure of the boats were important to the warring nature of the Vikings at that time. And they extended over to Greenland and had colonies set up there, and even into Newfoundland. I was just watching a recent Nova episode that showed they have just recently discovered a new Viking camp. Well, it's not a new camp, but the architect, the remains of a camp that had existed much further south than they had thought in Newfoundland.
Yeah, actually, I think what you mean by Newfoundland is the Labrador section of Newfoundland, the mainland section.
I do believe so, but I'm not certain. But it's interesting because there was more than one camp there, and people hadn't realized that. But of course, the Vikings didn't stay primarily because the Native Americans who were there drove them off. And so that was the main reason they didn't stay. At least that's the dominant theory.
Well, I think also, again, they probably over time lost contact with their home.
Oh, definitely, yes.
And that also, I think one of the things about the Vikings that, as I understand it, is that their connection back home was very important to them. They weren't looking to create a separation.
Right. In fact, the first man was Eric the Red, who set up a settlement in Greenland, who was Leif Erikson's father. And he had committed a number of crimes and was declared an outlaw. So the reason for going out and establishing a new settlement was he didn't have the option of home anymore. He was chased away from his home.
Yeah. So anyway, now how did they find their way? One of the things, by the way, about a boat that doesn't have a deep keel is, of course, it tends to be easily kind of driven off course. It also tends to tip over a little easier. So you had to be pretty courageous to go on one of these.
Right.
But you also you had to be able to find your way. What were some of the things that made the Vikings such unique travelers?
Well, they did know how to navigate by stars, and they knew how to navigate to some extent by the sun, the rise and set of the sun. So they knew their ways around, but they also did sometimes navigate along shorelines too. So they wouldn't, if you're going over from Scandinavia and over to Newfoundland, you wouldn't go straight across. You'd come up and you'd go along the coast of Greenland in order to come over there. So they would quite often keep land within their sights.
But they did develop some methods of kind of sighting,
right,
that weren't available to other navigators, partly because they would go venturing out onto the open sea. If you're not venturing out onto the open sea, you don't have to worry about that kind of navigation.
Right.
As you say, you can follow But now, not all of the travel in this book is quite as expected, though. It's not all just between the British Isles and Scandinavia. There's one character in the book who has come a rather long way. She comes from...
Oh, there is a young Persian woman.
Yeah.
She has an interesting background. She was raised in a very wealthy family, but the family lost their wealth, and she ended up being sold to another man who was in Persia, who then sold her again into someone who brought her over to Nendrum Monastery. And in fact, Nendrum Monastery is where she and Wasso, who's one of the other main characters in my book, have met, first of all. And then they go their separate ways, largely due to a Viking raid, and then they come together again. And it's important for the flow of the book.
These were not feminist times. I mean, they're not humane times either. People are taken and enslaved.
Right.
But women are sold. They're sold by their family.
Right. In certain.
Nowadays, of course, that still goes on in places like Afghanistan, for example, but they call it marriage.
Right.
But it's still sale.
Yes, there's a dowry, there's all sorts of monetary exchanges as they're trying to place the women, and it isn't often up to the women where they go. So that does still occur today. But I did have my characters in my book care about each other. And Goda cared sincerely about his sister, certainly, and Wasso about this young Persian woman, Statira, who those two fell in love over a period of time. So in an individual one-to-one relationship, I think even in the 10th century, there were some powerful women, but it was a subtler thing than there is in a modern world where women can be leaders and not just supporting of men who are leaders.
Yeah. But it's still, even today, there are many places where women are treated as chattel. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but I recently had a short story, a piece of flash fiction about that, actually, called The Ripeness of Fruit. And it very much hinges on, being chattel. And one of the things when I was studying up on that was often that the woman, it isn't so much that she loved her husband to whom she was sold, but that she felt a deep need to please him, not just simply because she'd get beaten or returned or something, but her identity. And one of the things that goes on in your book that I like is that your characters don't just simply accept their destinies as identity, but rather they take arms against the sea of trouble and by opposing end them.
Right. That's definitely true. And there are areas and periods like Waso and Statira are traveling together a lot in search of his brother and sister. And there are times in certain environments where Waso is the dominant of the two and exercises his knowledge in order to bring them to safety. But there are other times in other environments where Statira knows a lot more about what she's doing than Waso knows, and she becomes the dominant person leading them on.
One of the things she knows more about, actually, is navigation.
Exactly, yes.
Which brings up another thing that I would like to talk about when we come back to Walking on the Weene Side, and we will be right back. Here we are, walking on the Weene Side. We're talking with Steve Lindahl about his very fine book, Under a Warped Cross. And I want to just tell you folks, it's available on Amazon in print and Kindle. And you should really look for it because it's a good read. But one of the things I did want to just kind of branch out from here, we've been talking about Persian character and her knowledge of navigation. And one of the things I like about your writing in general, Steve, is that you are not bound in to the tradition that the world centers on London, and then that center crosses the ocean to New York, and the rest of the world kind of is out there. You, for example, in this book, make us aware that the people of Persia, of ancient Persia, were navigators and were traders and had their own culture. And that's
Right.
and I know that, for example, in your very wonderful book, White Horse Regressions, you bring up China.
Right, yes. The White Horse Regressions is one of my past life mysteries,
Right.
where people are trying to solve a modern mystery by going back to people's past lives in various points of history. And the people in White Horse Regression shared a past life in Victorian London, but then also in the Han Dynasty in China. So it went to those two places with people having characters with different roles in those different places.
But interplaying and repeating their connections.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes the major calamity that occurred is a repeating tragedy. And so they're trying to figure out what happened back then so they can deal with how the similar events are happening now.
Yeah.
But this one, Under a Warped Cross, is pure historical fiction.
My segue, my head was because, of course, the Chinese were circumnavigating the globe long before Columbus. And, again, the assumption that we make that history is Eurocentric starts in London and kind of moves out of something.
Exactly. It's the whole Columbus discovered America. You cannot discover, the Vikings were there many years before, and they didn't discover America. You can't discover a place where there's already people living. That just doesn't make sense. So I can see what you're saying.
Yeah. So, and your writing in general, one of the things that I like about it is that your characters in general, not only are they motivated to take charge of their own lives and looking to find themselves in the world and kind of give themselves a place in the world, but they are aware that the world is greater than just their little village.
Well, that's true, yeah.
And I see that as very important in the modern world, because I think more and more it's kind of like we're especially in this country, we're so upset that the world is getting more and more connected that we want to put walls around ourselves.
Right. Yeah, that is a problem. A little unrelated to the book, but yeah, right. In modern times, we have a segment of our population who wants to fight diversity, and I've never understood the real motivation for that, because I find diversity in humanity to be extremely interesting.
It enriches us.
Yeah.
And in fact, in your book, even though there are negatives of being, certainly there was a negative of having a Viking raid on
That's good.
or being sold into somebody else's family or whatever. The positive is that your characters grow and they learn about the world, and they're constantly finding new things. For example, one of your characters is spreading knowledge of medicine.
Right. Yeah, he's one of my favorite characters because he's a little quirky. He spent some time in not a convent, but an abbey, and was training as a monk, and was discouraged by some of the other things that were abuses at the time. One in particular was, we've heard of sale of indulgences in the past. Well, there was also the trading of indulgences, per se, or forgiveness for sins in exchange for sex, which meant that a lot of the monks and the priests had little children wandering around out there that they did not acknowledge. Well, Elfgar, who's this character, he was upset by that and left the monastery. But he also had a little bit of an alcohol problem, so he gets into some quirky situations with that. But he's an intelligent man, and he learns about medicine, and he learns about the smith trade, so he becomes a blacksmith, and he has these trades that he can use to make some extra money, and also to kind of hide his real role, which is that as a member of this Underground Railroad, as I call it, resettling the victims of church abuse.
And of course, those skills are real skills that are important. And one of the things I thought interesting in Under a Warped Cross is that some of the medical skill he has, the implication that maybe we should know some of those things today still.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are probably some medical things that were used centuries ago that would still be helpful today. There's no doubt about that. But we've also advanced in a great many ways.
Yeah.
So,
but I think the thing is, one of the things that I think is very interesting is that, of course, part of the advance in retrogression, make up a word, of medicine is that as we have it into a specialized, controlled field with, laboratories and sale of pharmaceuticals and things, some of those traditional remedies are disappearing and even being made illegal, because if we use that, we won't be enriching.
Right. And we're losing some of our medicines from environmental issues, too.
Yeah.
I was reading recently that the Romans had a treatment for wounds that was very effective, would be great in this time period where we're having problems with overuse of antibiotics, but the plants they made it from have gone extinct, and so they're no longer available to us. So some of that's things we need to consider too. When we're looking back on history, sometimes there were ways of doing things back then that we can't even relate to anymore because we've lost something over the years.
And so it's wonderful to have books like Under a Warped Cross that make us aware of the richness of history. And that's one of the many reasons, folks, that I recommend it to you. And my guest today, Steve Lindahl, who wrote this and some other books, which you can find on Amazon. I already mentioned White Horse Regressions, and another one is Motherless Soul, which I've read. And I haven't read your other book, Hoptagong Vision Quest.
Yes, it's Hopatcong Vision Quest. That one, I did an interesting thing. That's one of my past life regressions. And one of the interesting things I did with that one is both the past lives and the modern life take place around the same lake, Lake Hopatcong, which is where the name came from. So it goes back to the Lenape Indians who inhabited that part of northern Jersey. And that's special to me because that area of the United States is special to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, folks. So, and Steve, do you have a website that people can find you on?
Sure, SteveLindahl.com. So that's SteveLindahl.com.
Mm-hmm. Now, also, Steve, do you want to give a little bit of a shout out to some of the other stuff you're doing? I know you're involved in at least one magazine these days, aren't you?
Yes, I'm the managing editor for Flying South, which is a literary magazine / contest that is sponsored by Winston-Salem Writers, a wonderful writing group out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And we are just in our last week of accepting submissions for this year's magazine. It's a $15 entry fee, And then the prizes are, everything is separated into 3 categories: fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And you get $500 top prize for the best in each one of those 3 categories. And then of those 3 categories, the president of Winston-Salem Writers gets to pick his favorite of those. And that person will be awarded an additional $500 for a total grand prize of $1,000. And then everything that's submitted is considered for publication in the magazine, which has been pretty favorably received. So we're pleased. We have a wonderful editorial staff, 3 fiction readers. We have a nonfiction editor who is Jennifer Stevenson. And she has been nominated for Pulitzers. We've got a poetry editor, Angel Claudel, who's a wonderful poet in her own right, but excellent at poetry reading, which is what's more critical as an editor. And then our fiction readers are myself and Bob Shar, and then Ray Morrison, who is also an award-winning writer. He is the fiction editor.
Folks, you can hear Steve's passion about literature. And I got to tell you right now, that passion does come across in his writing. And you really want to look for him both at his website and on Amazon. That name again, write it down, Steve Lindahl, SteveLindahl. And Steve, thanks so much for walking on the Weene Side today.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.
Dark warning. The air's so thick you can almost see the old box fan I got at the thrift agitating again it. The moon's so bright it lights the way to Babylon, yet hazed enough to call out spirit dead and set that dread that's buried in the human heart to stirring with screams and sobbings of despair, whilst horses dance about with nervous hooves and dogs bay long and low to fend such evil as about us in the damp night swirls. In the valley, riding his old black Ford, the Baptist preacher sways and rocks again the rusted door till it near bursts to dump him in the creek where trout and pickerel can nibble his fat toes like the worms we dig in Uncle Jethro's garden, whilst he smokes his pipe and pretends what he don't see. That preacher saves himself by swerving the wheel and bouncing up the rud like he's riding a chariot of death, come for the old woman Jones, who's busy with dying and still taking her time as if for to wait on his coming. That preacher ain't a racing to save no souls, leastwise not hers. There ain't not one person in all these hills who don't know and hate on her for being nasty mean. If it weren't for her potions and herbs, there's not a man nor woman who'd have truck with her at all. But them potions and herbs do hold the power. Power to heal and power to make a person sick and die. That's how she's lived so long. Longer than most and longer than she ever deserved. But even them that knows which'n die, and dying's what she's doing now. The preacher, he's got a fierce wanting after her potions and things she knows. Thinks maybe she'll teach him before she passes on. So there he is, bouncing and jouncing along that road, hurrying to the crone's place, hurrying to beat old Lucifer and his sulphurous horde, hurrying to talk that old woman out of all her knowing. And all that time, up on the spring hill, up where the trees turn from aspen and alder to pine and hemlock, up where the streams start up and bobble their way down to that creek, an old black bar was snuffing the wind and looking to mate. And an old bar has that urge. Why, best stay clear and let him satisfy the wanting. Off he roams and down that hill, snuffling, shuffling, and not caring one bit about naught but finding what he's been wanting. Seems like there's a wanting in all nature. The parson is wanting something evil and wrong, but full of power. The virus after something too, wanting and wanting. The one's jouncing and bouncing up a rutted rud, the other pushing and growling down the stream. Farther on up that rud, well past where it crosses the crook, where a car can ford it easy, that old woman, she sets up and starts in laughing like the devil's tickling at her feet, larking and laughing like there ain't no end in sight. All of a sudden she keels over. She's gone wherever her light goes. And down that rud, there at that ford, the preacher's car and the black bar come together with a bang and a howl. The bar ran off. No rut this night. The car is dead. They'll need a team to pull her out. And that preacher? Well, he's dead too. Blood and bits of brain all about. Some have gone to feed the fish. Those are brains worm a man. Well, why's a fish to know or care?